Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Let's Be Real Here podcast. I am your host, Rory Wicks, and today's topic is the Republican Party. We're going to talk about some history, we're going to talk about Lincoln and Reagan, and we'll see how we got to where we are today. And let's be real here. The Republican Party, it's dying. The Republican Party, also known as the Grand Old Party, or GOP, was founded in 1854 as a coalition opposing the westward expanse of slavery. The Republican Party fought to protect the rights of African Americans after the Civil War. Today's GOP is generally socially conservative and favors smaller government, less regulation, lower taxes, and less federal intervention in the economy. Though the Founding Fathers didn't trust political parties, it wasn't long before they developed them. Supporters of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, who favored a strong central government and a national finance system, became known as Federalists. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson favored a more limited government. His supporters called themselves Republicans or Jefferson Republicans, but later became known as Democratic Republicans, later to be called just the Democrats. The Federalist Party dissolved around the War of 1812, and by the 1830s the Democratic Republicans had evolved into the Democratic Party, which initially rallied around President Andrew Jackson. Opponents of Jackson's policies formed their own party, the Whig Party, and by the 1840s Democrats and Whigs were the country's two main political coalitions. In the 1860 election, a split between Southern and Northern Democrats over slavery propelled a Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, to victory, though he won only about 40% of the popular vote. Even before Lincoln could be inaugurated, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union, beginning the process that would lead to the Civil War. Over the course of the Civil War, Lincoln and the rest of the Republicans would see the abolishment of slavery as a strategic move to help them win the war, leading to the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the United States. During this time, Republicans would become increasingly associated with big business and financial interests in the more industrialized North. The federal government had expanded during the war, including the passing of the first income tax. Moving into the 20th century, the Republican Party, due to their relationship with big business, would become known as the party of the wealthy, of the elite. With the rise of the progressive movement, which sought to improve life for working-class Americans and encourage Protestant values, some Republicans championed progressive social, economic, and labor reforms, including President Theodore Roosevelt, who split from the more conservative wing of the party after leaving office. Republicans benefited from the prosperity of the 1920s, but after the stock market crash in 1929 ushered in the Great Depression, many Americans blamed them for the crisis and deplored their resistance to use direct government intervention to help people. This dissatisfaction allowed Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt to easily defeat the Republican candidate Herbert Hoover in 1932. The relief programs included in FDR's New Deal earned overwhelming popular approval, launching an era of Democratic dominance that would last for most of the next 60 years. Between 1932 and 1980, Republicans won only 4 presidential elections and had a congressional majority for only 4 years. Though the centrist Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was president from 1953 to 1961, actively supported equal rights for women and African Americans, a conservative resurgence led to Barry Goldwater's nomination as president in 1964. This continued with Richard Nixon's ill-fated presidency and reached its culmination with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Meanwhile, many black voters who had remained loyal to the Republican Party since the Civil War began voting Democrat after the Depression and the New Deal. Reagan, after running on a platform based on reducing the size of the federal government, he increased military spending, spearheaded huge tax cuts, and championed the free market with policies that became known as Reaganomics. Many factors led to the rise of Reaganomics, including the candidate's optimistic outlook, celebrity status, and tough stance on national security. Economic and cultural factors played a major role as well. In 1976, with Ford in the White House, unemployment hit 9%. The post-World War II economic explosion had finally slowed, with blue-collar workers taking the bulk of the hit. In addition, the feminist movement had gained momentum, and along with the civil rights movement of a decade earlier, political attention was increasingly focused on minorities and women. That left traditional white working-class Democrats, whose economic struggles had been a decades-long decline, feeling out of place in the party. And truth be told, that's where it ended. The Republicans were not as popular with George H.W. Bush, and even less so with George W. Bush. The Tea Party sprouted up during the Obama administration, and that's kind of led us to where we are today. Now, the above information I mostly got from History.com, but it's important that we know the history, because the Republican Party that was is no longer. Around the time of Reagan, they shifted, and it really has never gone back. What I want to do now is take a closer look at Trump's Republican Party in comparison to the Republican parties of the past. Trump frequently, and as loud as he can, likes to compare himself to the Lincoln-era Republicans, even saying that no other president outside of Lincoln has done as much for the black Americans as he has. Lincoln, the man who freed the slaves. According to a Washington Post article, beginning in the 1960s, the party embraced a Southern strategy, forsaking the remnants of its Lincoln-esque heritage in exchange for the principles of states' rights and resistance to civil rights for African Americans previously associated with the neo-Confederate Dixiecrat wing of the Democratic Party. As a result, the Republican Party changed its identity and abandoned its original principles, becoming strikingly similar to the very opponents that roused Lincoln to resist in the beginning. So the truth is, there is no semblance of Lincoln's Republican Party left. Lincoln created a party to combat a civil war. He faced a Supreme Court which in Dred Scott v. Sanford declared that blacks were an inferior class who had no rights the white man is bound to respect. A decision intended to smash the new Republican Party, and a decision that unfortunately so many Trump supporters would likely support. Under Lincoln, the Republican Party stood for equal rights and opportunity, stood for political democracy and using the force of the federal government to crush slavery. Trump is widening the divide between the wealthy and the poor, making it harder for the downtrodden to pick themselves up, locking them into their homes with no means of escape. So Trump, stating that he is the party of Lincoln, while true in name, hasn't been the case for many years. And in my opinion, Lincoln would likely rather jump off the balcony of the Ford's Theater than call himself a Republican under Trump. Some Republicans, however, have taken to trying to compare Trump to Reagan, something that a lot of the middle-class white suburban people in their 50s really like, but even that comparison is a stretch. Reagan lowered the tax rate from 70% to 28% for the highest income earners, but by the end of his presidency, Reagan had took back about half of that tax cut with tax increases. And he was not shy about taxing the rich when necessary, such as by eliminating the preference for capital gains in 1986. Reagan said, "What we're trying to move against is institutionalized unfairness. We want to see that everyone pays their fair share and no one gets a free ride. Our reasons? It's good for society when we all know that no one is manipulating the system to their advantage because they're rich and powerful. But it's also good for society when everyone pays something, that everyone makes a contribution." Shit, I agree with some of that. I find it hard to believe that Trump, the man who still seems to believe in trickle-down economics, would agree, seeing as he's done nothing but give tax breaks to his rich friends. Reagan also pushed free trade policies, including the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement. This was the precursor to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, something Trump opposes. Oh, and Reagan also granted legal status to 3 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. He said, and I quote, "I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though some time back they may have entered illegally." End quote. Pretty sure we all know where Trump stands there. And there, I think, is one of the biggest differences between Reagan Republicans and the Trump Republicans. Reagan believed in discouraging employers from hiring undocumented workers. Trump has frequently hired undocumented workers himself. Reagan thought that without jobs, the incentive to cross the border illegally would lessen, and he understood that sealing the border was practically impossible and could not be done without creating severe problems for Americans, such as seizing private property and cutting off access to the Rio Grande River. Trump, however, is building a wall. I wonder how many listeners here know this, but Reagan showed support for reasonable gun control. He backed the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986, which banned the ownership of any fully automatic firearm not registered on May 19, 1986. Trump, however, yells to anyone that will listen that the left wants to take their guns, and he will hear nothing in terms of gun control. The more and more I look into this, I see similarities, not with Reagan and Trump, but with Reagan and Biden. The Biden campaign just released a plan to incentivize companies to keep their employees here and not send it overseas, something that has very Reagan vibes to it. And if you look at Biden's voting record, a lot of votes side with Republican ideology, something the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, like to remind everyone of. Looking at Biden's tax plan, according to Investopedia, Biden wants to raise top income tax brackets back to 39.6% from 37%, and the top corporate income tax to 28% from 21%. If elected, he will apply Social Security tax to earnings above $400,000, tax capital gains and dividends at ordinary rates for those with annual incomes of more than $1 million, and impose 15% minimum tax on book income of large companies. The tax rate on profits earned by foreign subsidiaries of U.S. firms will be doubled to 21%. The fact that we are taxing so little on foreign subsidiaries kind of boggles my mind. That seems ripe for corruption to me, but what do I know? Just a mortgage underwriter. According to the Tax Policy Center, Biden's tax proposals will increase revenue by $4 trillion between 2021 and 2030. It estimated that 93% of the tax increases would be by taxpayers in the top 20% of households. The top 1% of households would pay 3/4 of the tax hike. Biden opposes Medicare for all, but instead wants to make an expanded Affordable Care Act. Trump, in his 2021 budget proposal, has proposed deep health care cuts over the next decade, especially to Medicaid, $900 billion, and Medicare, $450 billion, and it requests $94.5 billion for the Department of Health and Human Services. That's a 10% decrease from the 2020 enacted level. Trump has repeatedly promised to bring down drug prices, even going so far as signing an executive order for it, but we haven't really seen significant results so far. In trade, Biden wants to become a world leader again, but before entering any new trade agreements, wants to raise up the middle class first, by focusing on Americans and reaching out to allies to form coalitions and treaties, not smacking every country with additional tariffs. The list goes on, and I'll link the article in the description of the podcast on my website. That way you can all take a look. But the reality is, under Biden, not much is going to change for the vast majority of Americans. Some rich people are going to have to start paying a little more in taxes and will be working to try and regain lost relationships with allies. But as Biden said to a bunch of donors, and I quote, "Nothing will fundamentally change," end quote. Just less fascism. Though I added the last bit. I think one of the most important distinctions between any of these parties that we've talked about, the Lincoln Republicans, the Reagan Republicans, and these Trumpists, is this focus on Christians with Trump. Sure, Reagan was kind of the forefather of the evangelical Christian movement, and not even as a Christian himself. He had been married twice, alienated from his children, and almost never went to church. Things that most evangelical Christians hold as a core tenet to their lives. But this new wave of social conservatives liked the idea of limited government and Reagan's anti-communist talk. With Trump, however, he leaned in. He cites the Bible as a talking point, but can't tell you his favorite verse. Even seeing the obvious staring them right at the face, people like Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, said, and I quote, "I believe he's president of the United States for a reason. I think God put him there," end quote. Last time I checked, God doesn't have the ungodly lead. Trump is leaning on the conservative values and things like anti-abortion, pro-gun rights, the Second Amendment, anti-LGBTQ, and he's doing this to keep them on their side. Even when he says he's a pro-LGBTQ president, his actions and his legislation say otherwise. Trump is feeding on fear that the country that was is going, maybe even gone already, and that only he can restore it to its former glory, though the glory that he speaks of either never existed or he hasn't actually put any policies to make it happen. One of his most recent talking points has been about how at the Democratic National Convention they removed God from the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, 1, they didn't, and 2, if they did, it would just be a more historically accurate pledge, since it didn't originally have God in it. That was added in the 50s during the Red Scare. It is yet another sizzle phrase to incite his base, and he's completely reliant on holding this demographic, since they do make up a majority of it. About 1 in 4 American adults belong to an evangelical Christian denomination, according to a Pew Research Center 2014 study, making evangelicals the most common religious group. I've watched as people I know and know well who weren't evangelical Christians go into that life and come out as a typical Trump supporter. Even before Trump was a nominee, like that mentality, that lifestyle. Someone who I knew never owned a gun. I went away for a couple of years and I came back and they're almost a gun enthusiast. It's like, do you love God? Do you love your country? Then you love guns. And if you didn't before, you'll love them eventually, because that's how they get you. Part of this Christian right philosophy is that the country was founded on Christianity. And admittedly, even I believed that for a long time. I even wrote poems about it, calling for a revolution. But alas, even I can be wrong. And I do want to put a disclaimer here, because a lot of what I've said and a lot of what I've been saying might sound hateful or against Christianity, and I'm not. I'm honestly against politicizing any religion. And right now, the Christians are the ones making the most noise, be it for power or if they believe they're being targeted or discriminated against. That's not the point. If anything, I would hope to open your mind to show you how unfaithful people are using your faith against you. And where I stand religiously, I guess it's very mixed. I spent my teens in an evangelical Christian church and house, and I tried the church game for a long time. In fact, it played a really big part in keeping me sober after years of drug abuse. So, there's no hate in my heart for God. I love God. Just sometimes I feel like his people don't love me. But I don't want to dive down this rabbit hole any further, because there's a lot more to talk about than just the Christians. Right now, in the political climate of the U.S., we have Trump, the Republican, yelling at Biden, a moderate Democrat, that he's going to be controlled by this radical left movement. Biden is a product of this government, like most politicians are right now. Remember, nothing's going to fundamentally change. In my opinion, and this is a big opinion, but I think Biden is becoming the leader of the new conservative party, also known as the Democrats, and the Republicans are being left behind as radicals, trying to move the country backwards towards a more white, more segregated America. Most of what Trump has done in terms of policy has just been rolling back growth that we made during the Obama administration and not implementing anything new, save for tariffs and relationship with the oligarchs and communists. He wants to eliminate Obamacare, even though, overall, Obamacare was good. It got me insurance when I didn't have any, and it helped millions of other Americans. Is it perfect? No. Far from it. I'm a supporter of Medicare for all, so Obamacare is like a wet noodle to me, but it's better than nothing. But Trump wants to roll it back and is, in fact, fighting it in court right now. He believes that he can then protect people by issuing an executive order to cover pre-existing conditions. Well, that won't matter much when millions of Americans lose their insurance once Obamacare is gone. He promised a new health care plan by August. August came and August went, and we have nothing, just the continued fight against Obamacare. In addition, he is unraveling the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. What a name. Put in place under the Obama administration, and it's yet another example of how the Trump administration is taking actions that divide rather than unify the country. That law requires state governments to identify barriers to housing access for certain specified groups and take affirmative steps toward ending housing discrimination and reversing damage from the many decades of residential segregation and racist housing policies, like opening up opportunities to live there with lower-income housing. The American dream is founded on housing. By taking that away to pretend to protect the property value of white suburban families, you are stripping the potential for any Black, Latinx, Native American, or any other American who is stuck from ever having the same opportunity. They are being forced into the same neighborhoods of highly concentrated poverty with no way out. These same areas, due to their proximity to highways, had an increase in pollution because of the businesses and factories all nearby. This leads to lower lifespans. Those same policies that created the segregation led to over-policing, which lead to mass incarceration, which leads to loss of political power. With the lack of political power, they can't do anything about the pollution, so property values go down, which means less funding for education. Less funding for education means worse and worse schools and less students graduating and instead going to more certain things around them, mostly drugs and violence. This is what we call systemic racism. So what is Trump's platform really? Small government, unless it's him wielding an executive order? Trump has issued 182 executive orders in his first term so far. For comparison, Obama did 147, Bush did 171, and Clinton did 128. That's not how this country works. You don't get to just write an executive order because you don't like the rules or process. His team around him even tries to tell him this because he talks about it in his press conferences, saying things like, well, we have the power, but they say we have to go through Congress, and if they don't, we'll do it, because we have the power. Or however he says it, I don't know. I'm not a Trump impersonator, and I don't want to be. It's ridiculous either way. The Republican Party was founded by a group of radicals from the Whig Party to independence. It evolved, and it became a party that believed in free and unencumbered trade, a robust international presence leading the free world, responsible fiscal policy and limited government, constitutional conservatism, and the rule of law. It's turned into a party of money-mongers who worship King Trump like a god. Republican leadership led by Moscow Mitch folded like paper when Trump forced his way into their party and they forgot all they stood for. The RNC didn't even release a platform. They just said they'll go with Trump, whose platform boils down to Trump and whatever the fuck he wants today. The RNC didn't even ask former President Bush to speak at their convention. Maybe because he's openly against Trump, but last I checked, the convention is about Republicans, not about Trump. The Republican Party every day seems more like the Communist Party of North Korea. Look at what happens to those that disagree with him. Mitt Romney, who at one point was the GOP representative to be president of the United States, is now an outsider because he opposed Trump. Look at everyone who works for Trump, who no longer does. He talks shit about them and then badmouths them with no one in the GOP to defend them. Not if it might upset King Trump. They can't do that. That would be political suicide, and it shouldn't be. He's turned the Republican Party into a cult where you can't step out of line, and if you do, you're a loser or a sucker. Maybe that's just our military, according to Trump. With the direction and the pace that Trump is taking the Republican Party, it's no surprise that people are jumping ship and joining the moderate Joe Biden. But it's far from enough to look like a sweep. Trump's supporters are radical. They love him. In Michigan, just the other day, they started a "We Love You" chant at the airport rally where he spewed venom for 80 minutes. They think he's sent by God. When he was elected, 80% of evangelicals voted for Trump. And that's more than George W. Bush, who actively talked about his faith and rebirth in Christ. Comparing the Republican Party of the past to the Republican Party of today, I'm honestly not sure how we got here. They aren't even close to the same. I can see why at one point in my life I was a Republican, believing in the free market, believing in the people. I was wrong, but at least it seemed reasonable. Looking at what Trump says and what he does, it's no longer reasonable. It's fear. It's hate. Trump and his radical followers are dangerous because some of what he says is true. He yells about the system because it's broken, but he isn't fixing it. He's manipulating it to get his way, and he stands above them as their shepherd, and they bend the knee like he's their God. It might sound like I'm being dramatic, and at one point maybe I was. But seeing the shit that he says on Twitter and in his speeches, it has to be true. Because there's no other way that people would eat up this garbage. This past week, Bob Woodward dropped his book, and in it was the bombshell that he's been downplaying this virus, that since February, he has known that it was airborne and it was deadly. Now, I believe that he downplayed it because I think that's obvious by his lack of doing literally anything save for the travel ban, which is the only thing he seems to be able to talk about. But do I see this as this big, oh my God, he's lying? No, not anymore. Trump always lies. And had he told us anything more in February, I don't think anything would have changed, because he had already implemented the travel ban, and that's the only thing he was going to do. So I don't think much would have changed, but the news likes to blow everything up and out of proportion, so it's no surprise that that's the only thing anybody's talking about. I guess all in all, it's no surprise to me that the Dems are becoming the new conservative party because they're supporting what a majority of Americans want. And from them, this new progressive party will sprout. If it's the People's Party or Humanity Forward, I don't know. But the Republican Party is no longer a party of the people. It's a party of Trump. And who knows if it's going to survive once he loses. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Till next time. Rory Wicks.